During the early years of the Galactic Civil War, the Rebel Alliance established its headquarters on the jungle moon Yavin 4, a remote, little visited and seemingly unremarkable world. Yavin 4 was out of the way enough that the rebellion was able to operate there for years without detection, and at first glance, it might have seemed like an ordinary backwater world, otherwise uninhabited by sentient beings. But as the moon's ancient temples attested, Yavin 4 had history, a much darker history than you might expect. Before it was home to the Rebel base, Yavin 4 was the last fortress of the Sith Empire, a tainted world of terrible secrets where the Sith warrior caste, the Massassi, hid out for 1,000 years, awaiting the rise of a new Dark Lord that would grant them their revenge against the Republic. In this video, we'll be telling the full legend story of Yavin 4, taking a comprehensive look at its history, ecology, and place in the galaxy.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Yavin 4 was located in the Yavin system, which lay in the Gordian Reach sector of the Outer Rim territories, 40,500 light-years from the core. Located in the thinly populated Trans-Hydian region, the Gordian Reach was a backwater sector, home to a collection of largely unremarkable mining worlds, minor industrial planets, and obscure colonies, all with low populations and low profiles. The Yavin system was located in the Gordian Reach's western sub-region, the Loop Worlds, which were connected to galactic civilization by tributaries of the Hydian Way. The core region of the Loop Worlds was part of the Republic during its final 3 millennia, part of the CIS during the Clone Wars, and under Imperial rule during the Age of the Empire, but the Gordian Reach was pretty much ignored by all three governments. Galactic civilization had little interest even in the populated worlds of the sector, to say nothing of the unpopulated worlds, and this meant that the Yavin system, which lay on the fringe of the Loop Worlds along a minor hyperspace route, was little visited and obscure. Specifically, the Yavin system lay along the Yavin Bypass, a minor hyperspace route that served as a shortcut between two other minor routes in the remote parts of the Loop Worlds. On one end, the bypass ran to Krylon, a middling, polluted industrial planet on the Pinoran Spur, while on the other, it ran to Val, an uninhabited plains world on Wetian's Way. The Yavin bypass saw negligible traffic, and what traffic it did see rarely stopped at Yavin. The Yavin system's central star was the K-type orange dwarf Yavin, which was orbited by the barren, searing hot planet Aphidan, the captured comet Stroiketsi, and the gas giant Yavin Prime. All three of these worlds were uninhabitable, and the only noteworthy one was Yavin Prime. With a diameter of 198,500 kilometers, Yavin Prime was massive, even for a gas giant, and it was orbited by 26 moons. 3 of these moons were habitable: Yavin 4, Yavin 8, and Yavin 13. Yavin 13 was an arid desert world home to 2 sentient species, the Slith and the Gerb, both of which were low-tech and kept to themselves, while Yavin 8 was frigid, dominated by tundras and icy seas, and home to the aquatic Melody, a reclusive mermaid people. Then there was the largest moon of all, and the only one to find its way into the history texts, Yavin 4. Yavin 4 was by far the most lush of Yavin Prime's 3 habitable moons. It was pretty big for a moon, with a diameter of 10,200 kilometers, not much smaller than your average terrestrial planet. Yavin 4 had standard gravity, a breathable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, and a mostly pleasant climate that ranged from temperate to tropical. A day on Yavin 4 lasted 24 hours, while a year lasted a staggering 4,818 days. The moon had a molten metal core and a thick, low-relief silicate crust, and although its surface wasn't tectonically active, it still had a lot of geological activity, in part due to being a relatively young world. This activity littered the moon with volcanoes, as well as large quantities of obsidian and other volcanic rocks. 67% of Yavin 4 was covered by land masses, which were divided between 4 continents. Imperial era scouts named these landmasses Starloft, Swyvern, Kus, and Wetian, the latter of which was the largest of the bunch and the site of most of the moon's important locations. The remaining 33% of Yavin 4's surface was covered by 6 interconnected shallow oceans. Yavin 4's continents were largely dominated by dense jungles, both temperate and tropical rainforests, and treacherous swamps, which were punctuated by towering mountain ranges and the occasional volcano. Yavin 4 had 2 primary seasons, the wet season and the dry season, and during the wet season, weather on the moon could be unpredictable and violent, with fearsome storms regularly coming out of nowhere to thrash the jungles. This, combined with volcanic activity and the moon's rugged and densely forested terrain, made exploration of Yavin 4 challenging. As a consequence, most of the moon was unmapped, and the parts that weren't were mostly located on Wetian in the vicinity of the Massassi site, the region where Yavin 4's most ancient and important temples were located. The Massassi site region was an especially rugged part of Wetian, sandwiched between a volcanic mountain range and the coast. Lesser arms of the mountains, including Ursham Ridge and the Yunte Mountains, wound their way through the region, while individual inactive volcanoes, among them Nicolo Peak and Burundi Peak, were scattered throughout the surrounding forests. The Un River flowed through the heart of this region, branching out into the Taurine Delta where it met the ocean, and it divided the site's forests into several sub-regions. Notable regions of the Massassi site area included the Wayward and Velanos jungles, the Swamp of Fallen Stars, and a lake that contained the Isle of Kun, a small forested island. Each of these regions, as with the entirety of Yavin 4, teemed with life. Yavin 4's jungles, swamps, and rainforests were packed with different species of plant life and fungi, from small shrubs to towering trees. Arguably the most important of Yavin 4's flora was the Massassi tree, which dominated the jungles of Wetian and several other parts of the planet. Massassi trees could grow up to 200 meters tall, and they were known for their purple bark, upsweeping branches, and broad crowns. Green and yellow climbing ferns grew on their trunks, while mulch formed from Massassi bark helped fertilize the jungle's soil, creating a thriving undergrowth. The Massassi trees weren't the only trees on Yavin 4, however. Marsh grubber trees dominated the swamps, while Shechual and fruit-bearing boffa trees could also be found in the moon's forests. Rough-barked jungle creeper vines and brightly colored nebula orchids grew around Yavin 4's trees for support, while the undergrowth featured countless species of exotic shrubs. Some of these were benign, like the massive feather ferns, the vibrant octogave, and the meter-tall kite plants, while others were thorny and could be hazardous, among them scrub-like clawthorns and flowering, razor-sharp raventhorn vines. Other plants were dangerous in more exotic ways, such as the appropriately named touchknots, which exuded a caustic resin that caused chemical burns and blisters upon skin contact. Wet weeds dominated the jungle's waterways, while cobalt-colored blue-leaf shrubs found their way into every corner of the moon. Blue-leaf shrubs produced oils that could be imbibed as a stimulant, enhancing the perception of the user. The blue leaf wasn't the only lifeform on Yavin 4 with unusual uses either. The seed of the purple-flowered kibo plant was said to be able to restore sight to the blind, while grenade fungi, when dried, could be thrown as grenades. Of course, Yavin 4 had animal life as well, which filled the jungles with their chilling shrieks and moans. The seas, lakes, and rivers teemed with octopedal lizard crabs, silman eels, shrimp-like crawfish, and many species of actual fish, among them blackfish, bluefish, and blowfish. These were eaten by aquatic predators like the river-dwelling armored eel and the large, many-eyed aquatic gundark, which also ate whisper birds and runyips. The aquatic gundark was entirely unrelated to the more well-known gundarks of Vanquor. These creatures were eel-like, possessed large fins, and hunted like crocodilians. The shores of Yavin 4's rivers and lakes were also prowled by anglers, a species of bizarre, blob-like crustaceal mollusks that fished for prey with their long tentacles. Among their prey were similarly bizarre creatures known as mucous salamanders, swamp-dwelling amphibious reptiles that were hard and scaly on land but became amorphous and mucus-like in consistency while underwater. Yavin 4's swamps were also home to several species of amphibians. These included the leathery, frog-like spined puks, which had sharp spines loaded with venom that caused blindness, and the barbed ginks, a mostly harmless type of large frog. Both the swamps and the jungles swarmed with insects of all descriptions, some dangerous and some merely annoying. Harmless insects included rosewings, which were known as pegolars as pupae, and multicolored button beetles, which ate the nectar of nebula orchids. The small, purple-shelled garnants had stinging bites, but they weren't really dangerous, unlike some of Yavin 4's other insects. Large, hard-shelled tank mites fed on carrion and could be aggressive, while vine-dwelling viper wasps had potent venom with all sorts of nasty effects on human biology. Yavin 4's largest insects were the clicknicks, which were roughly human-sized, lived in complex hives, and could be rather aggressive. But the moon's most infamous insects were the piranha beetles, flesh-eating insects with colorful shells, sharp mandibles, and vicious tempers. They built hives of saliva and chewed vegetation in Yavin 4's treetops, and while they were small and individually not much of a threat, they were prone to attack large animals in swarms, rapidly and painfully devouring them. Swarms of piranha beetles attacked and ate large animals like runyips, and they could also devour a human, as Bevel Lemelisk, the designer of the first Death Star, learned firsthand during his first execution by Emperor Palpatine. Many reptile species also haunted Yavin 4's jungles, among them nocturnal lizard rodents, herbivorous stump lizards, and green and red stinger lizards. Thrussels were more exotic serpentine lizards with 12 legs, while finned blaggarts were the more conventional serpents, known for their large, red-colored head fins. Other snake species native to Yavin 4 included the crystal snake, a translucent creature with refractive scales and non-lethal venom, which put prey into a deep sleep for up to an hour. More dangerous winged reptilians, known as stone rays, haunted the swamps and jungles at night, disemboweling prey with their sharp tails. While chitterwebs and chucklucks dwelled in the treetops, many species of birds prowled the skies above them, including reptile birds, belly birds, kite hawks, insect birds, and blue-feathered gorts. The most distinctive birds on Yavin 4 were the whisper birds, which were known for their brilliant gold plumage, dexterous tongues, and their ability to fly completely silently. Whisper birds lived in the treetops, but they were also frequently seen around bodies of water, as they primarily ate fish, weeds, and the nectar funnels that grew on Yavin 4's vines. In turn, they were often eaten by aquatic gundarks and stinterils. Yavin 4's birds shared the skies with stone bats and the much more dangerous gackle bats, the latter of which were large, vicious predators armed with muscle-relaxing venom, which they used to subdue stinterils, their main food source. Several species of large, ground-dwelling animals lived in Yavin 4's jungles, some dangerous and some peaceful. Two species of large, docile herbivores lived in the jungles: the beaked bipedal mulgax and the stubborn, antlered runyips. Runyips were clawed, furred, and had prehensile noses, and while they were large and tough, they were often preyed upon by Yavin 4's predators. Among Yavin 4's other mammals were several monkey-like species, among them the herbivorous yet highly aggressive screegs, the solitary skittish mummians, and the curious pot-bellied woolamanders, which had brightly colored fur and primarily ate fruits. Woolamanders had claws and were known to throw rocks, but they were nonetheless preyed upon by stinterils and swarms of Priyanha beetles. Of course, not all of Yavin 4's large beasts were docile. The aforementioned stinterils, for example, were vicious, hyperactive predators, rodents known for their forked tails, sharp teeth, and extremely high metabolism, which required them to eat constantly in order to not starve to death. Stinterils were known to eat their own when no food was available, and they also fed on woolamanders, whisperbirds, and others. Other predators on Yavin 4 included rakmars, a kind of mammalian ambush predator, the jumping spider, the reptavian wolf-like choku, and the howlers, a species of fearsome reptilians with long spines and sharp claws, which subdued their prey with loud howls. At some point, a population of aggressive feline Krakya from Bothawoi was established on Yavin 4, where they became known to the Massassi. The largest known beast on Yavin 4 was the Underlurker, an enormous, rancor-like beast with a tough hide that lived in the caves beneath one of the moon's temples. It's unclear if this animal was native to Yavin 4 or if it was a creation of the Sith. If the latter, the Underlurker was in good company. Several other Sith-spawn beasts also prowled parts of Yavin 4, although they mostly kept close to the Massassi temples. Tuk-Ata, or Sith Hounds, had been brought over from Korriban, while Jedi-hunting Terentatex and two-headed battle hydras had been bred in the temples by Exar Kun before being released into the jungles. The most fearsome Sith-spawn beast of all was the Sith Wyrm, an enormous carnivorous creature that had been created by Naga Sadow's alchemy. The Massassi of one part of the moon worshipped the Sith Wyrm before it was slain by Exar Kun. For all of its abundant wildlife, Yavin 4 had no native sentient species, and by the time the Rebel Alliance arrived on the moon, it had no permanent population to speak of. But that hadn't always been the case. For more than 1,000 years, Yavin 4 had been home to the last of the Massassi, and though they were long dead by the time of the Empire, they had nonetheless left their mark on the moon. These settlers came to Yavin 4 in 5000 BBY, and to understand their story, we need to quickly switch gears and talk about the ancient Sith Empire. In 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire stood at a crossroads. For the past 2000 years, its ruling Sith Lords had grown powerful through their study of the dark side of the Force, while their servants, the red-skinned Sith species of Korriban, conquered over 100 systems in their name. Under Dark Lord of the Sith, Marka Ragnos, the Sith Empire entered a golden age. But in 5000 BBY, Ragnos died, and the question of who would succeed him as Dark Lord of the Sith sparked a bitter debate about the Sith Empire's future. One claimant, Ludo Kresh, sought to stay the course Ragnos had followed and keep things as they were, to prioritize stability over conquest. But Kresh's rival, Naga Sadow, believed that the Sith Empire had become stagnant and complacent, and that it would decline if it didn't seek out new territories. To shake the Empire out of its stagnation, Sadow believed that the Sith should launch an invasion of the Galactic Republic. The Kisai, the ruling priest caste of the Sith species, initially supported Ludo Kresh, but Naga Sadow had the loyalty of the Sith warrior caste, the fearsome Massassi. With their help, Sadow manipulated the other Sith Lords into naming him the Dark Lord of the Sith. Those Sith Lords who still opposed Sadow were assassinated by their own Massassi troops, and the Sith Empire began an invasion of the Republic. In the brief but devastating Great Hyperspace War, Sith forces poured into the heart of the Republic, attacking Coruscant and several other key Republic worlds. But despite the strength and battle fury of the Massassi, the invasion was repulsed, and Sadow's forces were forced to retreat back to Sith space. The Republic Navy pursued, beginning an invasion of the Sith Empire. Realizing that his forces were outmatched, Naga Sadow decided to flee Sith space entirely. He had the Massassi kill their commanders, take control of what was left of the fleet, and begin using suicide tactics against the Republic invasion force to create a distraction. As they did, Sadow had his flagship, the battleship Corsair, make a hyperspace jump deep into unknown space. Sadow and his crew wound up in the Yavin system, where they decided to hide out on Yavin 4, far from Sadow's enemies in the Republic and the crumbling Sith Empire. The Corsair used its concussion missile batteries to obliterate a section of the jungle, forming a clearing at the heart of what would later be known as the Massassi site. The ship then landed at the center of the clearing, and Sadow's crew and troops, roughly 1,000 Massassi all told, began clearing away more of the jungle. Sadow ordered the Massassi to begin building a series of stone temples across the site, the hubs of his empire in exile. They began with the Temple of Fire, which was built over the landing site of the Corsair, entombing the battleship within. Over the course of the next few decades, the Massassi gradually spread out across Yavin 4, building Sadow's temples and other monuments to their Dark Lord, while Sadow continued his studies of the dark side and of Sith alchemy, creating Sith worms and mutating his Massassi subjects, twisting them into powerful abominations dominated by bloodlust and hate. Despite Naga Sadow's increasingly cruel treatment of them, most of the Massassi revered the Dark Lord, devoting themselves to the construction of his temples. But Sadow's alchemical experiments eventually turned some of the Massassi against him, leading to a brief rebellion. A group of Massassi that had escaped the experiments formed their own tribe and began a series of raids on Sadow's temples, hoping to unseat the Dark Lord and free the Massassi people. But these renegades, the last free Massassi, were captured by Sadow's warriors and mutated like the rest, and the rebellion came to an end. Not long after, following decades of work perfecting his Sith alchemy, Naga Sadow placed himself into suspended animation in one of the temples, awaiting a time when the Sith could return. In his absence, the Massassi were left to their own devices, and as Sadow slept for centuries, they formed their own civilization. The Massassi had been the warrior caste of the Sith for tens of thousands of years before fallen Jedi conquered their original homeworld of Korriban and established the Sith Empire. They were one of the lowest castes in Sith society, ranked above the slave caste, the Grotu, but below the engineer and priest castes, the Zuguruk and Kisai. The Massassi had been bred to be strong, loyal, and aggressive, and they were indoctrinated to be the unquestioning servants of their masters, first the Kisai monarchs and later the Sith Lords. The Massassi had many traits in common with the other Sith, among them red skin, fleshy tendrils that hung from their faces, high cheekbones, cartilaginous ridges above their eyes, 4 clawed digits on their hands and feet, and, most importantly, a strong, innate connection to the dark side of the Force, which they could feed on for sustenance. But due to selective breeding, the Massassi had become biologically distinct subspecies, possessing many traits that other Sith did not. They were taller, with an average height of 1.9 meters, and they were generally broader and more muscular as well. Massassi had sharp, predatory features, small noses and ears, and pale yellow eyes which glowed and lacked pupils. Massassi had extremely keen senses, especially hearing, and their skin was extremely tough, resistant to burns and laceration. Originally, Massassi could grow hair, which they usually wore long and shaggy, and compared to other Sith subspecies, they were short-lived. Massassi were considered children until age 10 and elderly after just 35 years, and even those Massassi that died of old age rarely lived past 50. The Massassi on Yavin 4 were originally no different from the rest of the Sith Empire's warrior caste, but Naga Sadow's alchemical experiments made them all but unrecognizable, transforming them into Massassi abominations. These mutant Massassi were more beast-like and less intelligent than their forebears, but they were also far more physically powerful. Massassi abominations were towers of muscle, averaging between 2 and 3 meters in height, with broad chests and thick limbs. They were hunched so that their necks were hard to discern from their heads and chests, and they had rows of fleshy spines along their arms and backs. Their facial tendrils and brow ridges were enlarged, and they grew more tendrils than their ancestors did. These Massassi didn't grow hair, but they did retain many of their ancestors' other features, among them their glowing, pupilless yellow eyes, their red skin, the 4-clawed digits on their hands and feet, and their sharp, predatory features. They retained their short lifespans, strong connection to the dark side, and their acute senses, and their thick hides were even stronger than they were before. Massassi abominations were extraordinarily strong, fast, and agile, and they could shrug off blows that would kill a lesser combatant. Naga Sadow had made them into purpose-built killers, but in his absence, these Massassi became much more. In the centuries after they settled Yavin 4, these new Massassi spread out across the moon and multiplied, building new societies out in the jungle. They lost or abandoned the vast majority of the advanced technology they had brought to Yavin 4, initially becoming simple hunter-gatherers, but they thrived nonetheless. The Massassi lived in tribes led by priests and elders, and as living memory of Sith domination faded, they developed their own culture. The warrior ethos the Massassi had been bred for endured, but in the absence of enemies to fight, they became hunters more than warriors, slaying the beasts of Yavin 4's jungles for food and for glory. They developed their own language too, a simpler derivation of the ancient Sith tongue, which had a written component of glyphs and ancient Sith characters. The Massassi lived in simple villages in the jungle, but they also continued to occupy the temples they had built for Naga Sadow, which became fortresses and places of worship for the Massassi tribes. Massassi warriors made use of a variety of weapons made of simple materials and pieces of metal their ancestors had brought with them to Yavin. The most infamous of these was a traditional Sith weapon known as Lanvarok, a razor-sharp throwing disc that was hurled from the end of a specialized staff. Massassi could hurl Lanvaroks with incredible strength and precision, slicing up anyone unfortunate enough to get in their way. Elite Massassi warriors made use of wooden battle staffs and black-bladed ceremonial swords known as Massassi brands, while others carried bladed knucklers, double-ended lances, and ink rifles which fired spurts of viscous, paralyzing ink. In the first decades after they came to Yavin 4, the Massassi honored Naga Sadow as a god, but in secret, they developed their own religion, the seeds of which were planted the moment they first looked to Yavin's skies. As recorded in their ancient history texts, the Book of Massassi, the Massassi came to worship the gas giant their moon orbited. Yavin Prime loomed large in Yavin 4's skies, an enormous red orb that hung over the moon. It eclipsed the sun at times, and it cast a shadow over the Massassi's entire world. The Massassi were fascinated by, yet afraid of Yavin, which made them feel insignificant by comparison, and they longed to overcome this by touching the face of their god, which they believed would make them gods themselves. When Naga Sadow ordered the Massassi to build temples for him, they agreed. They did so with a dual purpose. They built the temples to their Dark Lord's specifications, but they secretly did so to be closer to their god, to climb toward the heavens and be exalted in the process. But even after Sadow went into stasis, and even after becoming the undisputed masters of Yavin 4, the Massassi remained unsatisfied, because they felt that perfection continued to hang over their heads, so close and yet so far. For this reason, Massassi culture continued to revolve around Sadow's temples, which they now used to worship Yavin. The Massassi temples were all built of enormous stone blocks, which were partially composed of alchemically conducive calcite. They were built without any modern machinery, and many of them were designed to echo the shape of Sith holocrons. Naga Sadow's original purpose behind building the temples was unclear to later archaeologists. Some believe that the temples were actually massive dark side communication devices used to reach Sith lords on the far side of the galaxy, while others observe that the temples adhered to traditional Sith geometry and were probably meant to focus the power of the dark side. The largest and most important of Yavin 4's temples were built in and around the Massassi site. These included the Great Temple, an 8-sided pyramid at the center of a large clearing, surrounded by a complex of smaller monuments, viaducts, and other structures, as well as a network of underground catacombs known as the Isolation Chambers. The Temple of Fire, Naga Sadow's stronghold, was located near the Massassi site as well. This temple housed Sadow's battleship, the Corsair, in its lower vaults. The Temple of Fire was where Naga Sadow slept in suspended animation, and it was also home to his alchemical laboratories and vast stores of Sith artifacts. The Massassi performed sacrifices to Yavin here, feeding victims to a massive Sith worm that lurked in the depths of the temple. There were also other Massassi temples beyond the general vicinity of the Massassi site. Elsewhere on Yavin 4, the Massassi built structures like the steep-sided Temple Aton, the Massassi Arena, and the Temple of Sacrifice, where Naga Sadow hid many powerful Sith artifacts. The Massassi also built a traditional Sith tomb for Naga Sadow on the moon, although it would be some time before he was laid to rest there. For more than 500 years, the Massassi kept to themselves on Yavin 4, but in 4400 BBY, the moon was visited by a powerful dark Jedi by the name of Freedon Nad. Through the use of the dark side, Nad subdued the Massassi, who led him to Naga Sadow, who Nad awakened from his hibernation. Sadow took Freedon Nad as his apprentice, but once the fallen Jedi knew everything Sadow could teach him, Nad betrayed his master, killing him and usurping the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. Nad then left Yavin 4, seeking a world of his own to conquer, taking many Sith artifacts from Sadow's temple with him, while the Massassi laid Sadow's corpse to rest. Life on Yavin 4 then returned to how it had been before. But then, in 3997 BBY, yet another fallen Jedi came to Yavin 4, Exar Kun. Kun had been led to the moon by the spirit of Freedon Nad, and though he was rapidly succumbing to the dark side, he was still in denial, insisting that he was a Jedi. When he landed on Yavin 4, the Massassi attacked and subdued Kun, taking him to the Temple of Fire to be sacrificed to the Sith worm therein. Goaded by Freedon Nad's spectre, Exar Kun ultimately gave in to the dark side, channeling it through one of Naga Sadow's Sith amulets to destroy the worm. Freedon Nad was pleased, and he proclaimed Exar Kun as his Sith apprentice, but Kun then used Sadow's amulet to destroy Nad's spirit, claiming the title of Dark Lord of the Sith for himself. With his newfound command over the dark side, Exar Kun enslaved the Massassi once more, and he put them to work building new temples in his honor. Kun claimed the remaining artifacts in the Temple of Fire for his own, and he chose the Great Temple as his own stronghold, ordering the Massassi to expand it and build new temples across the Massassi site. A tall roof comb was added to the top of the temple, with skylights aligned to the equinox and solstice, and a grand hall tiled with precious stones. While the Great Temple was Exar Kun's main stronghold, he also had the Massassi build him a personal retreat, the Temple of Exar Kun, on an island near the outskirts of the Massassi site. This temple was built of polished obsidian studded with Coruscant gems etched with ancient Sith glyphs and arcane symbols, and crowned with a statue of the Dark Lord himself. Beneath the temples were catacombs, one of which contained Exar Kun's tomb, although Kun himself never occupied it. Elsewhere in the Massassi site, Massassi slaves built the Temple of the Blue Leaf Cluster, which housed a large energy crystal, and the Palace of Wulamander, where Exar Kun housed one of its most sinister dark side artifacts, the Golden Globe. As its name suggested, this was a large, glowing golden orb, and it had been instrumental in allowing Exar Kun to enslave the Massassi. Kun had imprisoned the souls of the Massassi's children in the Golden Globe, from which he could draw on them for power, essentially holding them hostage so that the adult Massassi wouldn't dare question his orders. Many of the Massassi slaved away building Kun's temples, while Exar Kun employed others as guards or raiders. He sent the latter on slaving raids across the Outer Rim, kidnapping untold thousands to be put to work building the temples. These new arrivals were generally treated even worse than the Massassi, who became their overseers, although a lucky few were assigned to less back-breaking duties, such as designing and manufacturing weapons emplacements to protect Kun's fortresses. All the while, the fallen Jedi devoted himself to the study of the dark side, mastering Naga Sadow's alchemical techniques and then improving on them. Kun bred battle hydras and Terrantiteks to guard his temples, and he recovered the Corsair from its vaults in the Temple of Fire. In 3996 BBY, Exar Kun allied with fellow fallen Jedi Ulic Qel-Droma, and the two rallied an army that laid waste to the galaxy in the Great Sith War. Yavin 4 served as Exar Kun's capital during the Great Sith War, and its Massassi and war beasts served him on the battlefield. But the war soon turned against Exar Kun, who was forced to flee back to Yavin 4 in defeat. The Republic Rim Fleet, under Jedi leadership, pursued him and established a blockade of the moon, trapping Kun and his followers on the surface. The Republic Army landed ground troops, which defeated Kun's Massassi warriors in battle, while the Republic Navy began an orbital bombardment of the temples. The Dark Lord realized that he was outmatched, and he summoned all the remaining Massassi to the Great Temple. There, he conducted a Sith ritual that allowed him to absorb their life forces, giving his spirit the power to transcend his mortal form, allowing him to roam the galaxy freely. But the thousands of Jedi gathered in orbit sensed the ritual as it was happening, and they worked together to create a wall of light around the moon, preventing Kun's spirit from escaping. When the wave of dark side power rising from the moon met the wall of light, it ignited a massive firestorm that swept across Yavin 4, laying waste to the moon. Many of the temples and fortresses on the moon, including the Temple of Fire, were completely destroyed, while others were merely ruined. Most of the jungles were destroyed, and nearly all of the remaining Massassi and slaves on the moon were killed. When all was said and done, Yavin 4 was in ruins. Exar Kun's spirit survived the ordeal, but he found himself trapped on the moon, bound to the ruins of his now empty temples, alone and largely powerless. With Exar Kun defeated, the Republic and the Jedi abandoned Yavin 4 for a time. For the next few decades, the only known resident of the Yavin system was Suvam Tan, a Rodian former slave of Exar Kun's who had survived the destruction of the moon. Suvam settled in an abandoned Republic orbital supply depot above the moon, which became known as Yavin Station. For the next 50 years, Suvam lived alone on Yavin Station, occasionally visiting Yavin 4 to scavenge the ruins of the temples. He received few visitors apart from exchange smugglers and Trandoshan pirates, who he sold experimental weapons to in exchange for food, supplies, and information. Suvam was still around by 3956 BBY. the last year of the Jedi Civil War, when the amnesiac Revan made several visits to Yavin Station. Sometime after the end of the Old Sith Wars, the Jedi returned to Yavin 4 to find that its climate had taken a turn for the worse. Hoping to reverse the environmental destruction, they built a secret underground terraforming station on the moon, the Lost City of the Jedi, where a group of Jedi worked to restore Yavin 4's ecosystem and subdue the restless spirit of Exar Kun. They succeeded in both tasks. By the 3600s BBY, Yavin 4 was once again covered by lush jungles, all its native species had recovered, and the spirit of Exar Kun was imprisoned in his temple. The Jedi then left Yavin 4 and erased it from public records, hoping to prevent anyone from reawakening the evil there. During the galactic wars between the Republic and the True Sith Empire, the Sith established a few outposts on Yavin 4, only for these to be overrun by the Order of Revan during the Revanite crisis. Revan had discovered that the spirit of the Sith Emperor, Tenebrae, was recovering on Yavin 4 after his defeat, and he wanted to resurrect him so that he could be killed. Revan and his followers were defeated, however, and the Emperor's taint left Yavin 4. Yavin 4 was officially rediscovered during the initial exploration of the Gordian Reach circa 3200 BBY, by which point the last surviving Massassi tribes had died out. Centuries later, in 2500 BBY, the moon again became a brief hotspot after Koroska gems were discovered deep inside Yavin Prime, leading to opportunistic gem fishers building space stations above the gas giant to mine for them. These efforts proved more costly than they were worth, however, and were abandoned, leaving the Yavin system largely desolate. For the next 2,500 years, Yavin 4 only received occasional visitors. A group of Kritakians settled on the moon at some point, while a band of pirates established a fortress there circa 2000 BBY. Nominally, the Yavin system became part of the Republic, and nominally, it fell within separatist space during the Clone Wars. 4 months into that war, Yavin 4's Great Temple Complex was the site of a ferocious lightsaber duel between Anakin Skywalker and Asajj Ventress, but apart from that, the Clone Wars left the Jungle Moon alone. It wasn't until the Galactic Civil War that Yavin 4 returned to prominence. After being forced to abandon their original main base on Dantooine, the Alliance to Restore the Republic set up shop on the Jungle Moon in about 1 BBY, a year into the conflict. Since Yavin 4 was obscure enough that it was often left off official maps, and since the Empire had no interest in the moon, the Alliance felt that it was the perfect location for a secret base, especially since the moon was littered with ready-made fortresses. On the recommendation of Alliance scout Druon Un, Alliance generals Jan Dodonna and Runes Sewell set up shop in Yavin 4's Great Temple, the former stronghold of Exar Kun, where they established Massassi Base. The Great Temple was built to be a fortress, but Alliance engineers still put extensive work into making it usable as a modern military base. While the temple's exterior was mostly kept intact, the interior was a different story. The original stone floors were reinforced with ferrocrete, the walls and ceilings were reinforced with sheets of seamed metal, and in some places, new rough-hewn cavities were carved into the structure to make room for new facilities. Originally, the interior of the Great Temple was divided into 4 cavernous levels, each of them hosting a massive open-plan hall, but the Alliance divided some of these into much smaller sublevels, installing new walls, floors, and ceilings made from modern materials, and they also dug out an additional sublevel below the ground floor. The ground floor and the new sublevel were both converted into enormous hangars, while landing zones were established in the large clearing outside of the temple's main entrance. The main hangar could be sealed off by an enormous blast door that lowered over the temple's main entrance, which was only the largest of many ways into the base, with most of the others being underground tunnels. The exterior landing zones were earmarked for visiting craft or large transports that were too big to fit in the main hangar, while most of the hangars themselves were given over to the Alliance's starfighters, which were a mix of Y-Wings and X-Wings, plus a handful of H-60 Tempest bombers and R-22 Spearhead interceptors. Fighters were prepped for launch or brought in after returning from action in the ground-level hangar, from which they would be transferred to the sub-level hangar via freight elevators for more in-depth maintenance. Most of Massassi Base's fighters and supply stores were kept on the lower level, as were a handful of larger transports for use in the event of an emergency evacuation. Underground passages connected both hangar levels to the outlying landing zones and other remote facilities, while a set of emergency turbo lifts could be used to access deep crust survival bunkers far beneath the temple, where personnel could shelter in the event Yavin 4 was subjected to orbital bombardment. The two levels of the temple above the main hangar were divided into about a dozen floors each and outfitted with most of the base's main facilities. The original second level was given over to storage space, technical workshops, barracks for thousands of troops, additional lodging for refugees, personnel support sections, the base's briefing room, and a backup power plant, while the floor above housed the base's command center, officers' quarters, medical facilities, security annexes, and a water reservoir. The top level, within the spire Exar Kun had added to the temple summit, housed the Great Temple's original Grand Audience Chamber, which the Alliance engineers deemed too beautiful to alter. This hall was instead used as a gathering place for ceremonies, while a small observation room at the temple summit was retrofitted to house communications gear. Anti-personnel turrets were housed in niches along the exterior walls of the temple, while larger defensive batteries were located in the surrounding jungle, including several ion cannons. The whole base was powered by an enormous generator retrofitted from the reactor of an Imperial Star Destroyer, which was located a good 2 kilometers away in the jungle. On top of powering the base itself, this generator powered the base's remote defensive emplacements as well as a powerful shield generator. Other Alliance outposts were located in the jungle around Massassi Base. These included remote recon towers around the base's perimeter, as well as the farther-flung Falcon and Raven bases. For over a year, Massassi Base served as the Rebel Alliance's central headquarters, although most of the Alliance's senior leadership kept to the ever-mobile Rebel fleet. General Dodonna served as the base's commander, and he and his staff planned, coordinated, and supported Rebel strikes against Imperial forces all across the galaxy. To facilitate these operations, Alliance scouts blazed new hyperspace routes between the Yavin system and more well-trafficked parts of the Gordian Reach. These new bypasses led from Yavin to the sector capital, Torque, and to Ladara, from which the secret Feswe corridor ran on to the Hydian Way. Roughly a year after Massassi Base was established, Rebel forces assigned to Operation Skyhook carried out a daring raid on nearby Toprawa on the Hydian Way, where they captured the schematics for the Empire's new superweapon, the Death Star. The Rebel strike team transmitted the plans to Princess Leia, who eventually was able to bring them back to Massassi Base to be analyzed by the Alliance. In the process, Leia led the Death Star to Yavin 4, sparking the climactic Battle of Yavin. In this battle, newly minted Rebel pilot Luke Skywalker managed to destroy the Death Star with a pair of well-placed proton torpedoes, and the course of galactic history changed forever. Of course, in the wake of the Battle of Yavin, the Empire now knew where the Alliance's headquarters was, and it wasted no time in ordering a counterattack. As the rebels on the moon evacuated their most important equipment, the Imperial Navy established a blockade of the Yavin system, and then a much larger blockade of the entire Gordian Reach. For 6 months, the blockade of Yavin saw regular skirmishes throughout the Yavin system and its neighbors, but Imperial forces waited to strike the killing blow. Darth Vader wanted them to hold off until his new flagship, the Executor, was ready, planning to avenge the destruction of one symbol of Imperial power by raising Yavin 4 with another. In the meantime, Massassi Base weathered regular harassment from Imperial forces, as well as from the private navy of Baron Tage, slipping small shipments of personnel and equipment through the blockade when they could. 6 months after the Battle of Yavin, the Executor arrived in the Yavin system, and the Empire's final assault began. In the evacuation of Yavin, Alliance forces fled the system while the Imperials laid waste to the jungle, destroying every last rebel outpost they could find. To provide cover for the evacuation, the rebel fleet attacked Imperial forces from the rear at Pinora, Clear, and the Valusk cluster, scattering the Imperial blockade of the Gordian Reach, while Alliance forces from Yavin 4 fled along the Fesware corridor, dodging an Imperial ambush as they did. The evacuation was largely successful, but many Alliance personnel nonetheless never made it off Yavin 4, including General Dodonna, who insisted on being the last person to leave the base. When Imperial ground forces finally seized Massassi base, the remaining rebels were captured and imprisoned, Dodonna among them. Following the evacuation of Yavin, the Empire set up shop on Yavin 4, establishing a military base, a penal colony, and a mining outpost on the moon. Salvagers flocked to the Yavin system from all over the galaxy, digging through the debris from the Battle of Yavin and the subsequent skirmishes for anything worth selling. For the most part though, Yavin 4 fell out of prominence again, and not much of note happened there until 4 ABY. That year, in the wake of the Battle of Endor, Grand Moff Ardus Kane ordered Imperial forces to abandon a wide swath of the Outer Rim in order to consolidate power in the new territories, and Yavin 4 was one of the places the Imperials abandoned. Virtually the moment they left, the fledgling New Republic moved in, establishing a small settlement, the village of Vornez, and a medical clinic for use by Republic forces operating in the region. This settlement seemingly didn't last long, however, and it was gone by 11 ABY when Yavin 4 once again found its way into the history books. That year, Luke Skywalker established the new Jedi Order, and he established the Order's headquarters and academy, the Jedi Praexium, in the Great Temple on Yavin 4. There, he trained his first class of a dozen prospective Jedi, although not without difficulty. The arrival of the Jedi in the Great Temple awakened the long-dormant spirit of Exar Kun, who attempted to corrupt Skywalker's students into becoming his servants. He killed one of them and briefly caused another to fall to the dark side, but when the Jedi realized what was happening, they banded together and defeated the Dark Lord, banishing his spirit to chaos. For the next decade, the Jedi Praexium on Yavin 4 flourished despite several attacks from Imperial remnant factions. The new Jedi Order banished the dark side from much of the moon, destroying the Temple of Exar Kun and freeing the souls of the Massassi children from the Golden Globe. But the Jedi were unable to stay on Yavin 4 forever. In 26 ABY, a year into the Yuuzhan Vong War, the Vong attacked Yavin 4 and leveled the Massassi site, destroying the Great Temple and the Jedi Praexium, although most of the Jedi on the moon were able to escape. A group of Yuuzhan Vong Shapers established a colony on Yavin 4, not knowing that they were inadvertently sowing the seeds of their people's defeat in the process. The Shaper compound on Yavin 4 was infiltrated by the Jedi Anakin Solo and Tahiri Vela, who inadvertently started a heresy among the Yuuzhan Vong that claimed the Jedi were not the enemy, but that they were heroes. A heresy that would go on to help topple the Yuuzhan Vong Empire. After the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War in 29 ABY, the Vong abandoned Yavin 4, but Luke Skywalker decided to move the new Jedi Order's headquarters somewhere else, and so Yavin 4 was left abandoned. It once again became a little visited backwater world, but with the mark it had left on galactic history, it would never again be obscure. So, that's our look at Yavin 4, a remote moon with more history than you might expect of it. But what do you think? Would you want to visit Yavin 4? Which phase of its history do you find the most interesting? Let us know your thoughts and more in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and let us know which planet you'd like to see us break down next.